A little girl whispers, "Please don't tie me again," and a millionaire father rushes into a home suddenly filled with tension. Fresh rope marks on her tiny wrists reveal fear far deeper than he ever imagined. Every corner, shadow, and object now tells a story of silent struggle and resilience. The mansion, once a safe haven, hides secrets that only careful observation can uncover. What he discovers next could change everything between him and the fragile trust that remains. The words hit him like a physical blow, immediate and raw. Everett froze mid-step, the echo of her voice resonating through the high ceilings and empty corridors, reaching into every corner of the mansion. It was a plea that carried weight far beyond her age, a quiet cry laden with fear, vulnerability, and exhaustion. His mind raced, simultaneously questioning how he had missed the signs and moving with an instinctive urgency toward the source. There was no hesitation, each heartbeat propelled him toward the room he had assumed was safe, a space he had long considered a sanctuary for his daughter. As he advanced, Everett's eyes scanned the hallways for evidence, anything that might explain the trembling urgency of her voice. The polished floors were empty save for faint reflections of dim lights. The familiar furniture and ornate rugs seemed suddenly alien, imbued with shadows that hinted at hidden struggle. Each step forward intensified the knot of dread in his chest. The silence, once a marker of peace, now amplified the panic threaded through her whisper. It was a voice that demanded acknowledgement, a fragile thread connecting him to her unseen world of fear. When he reached her bedroom, the air was thick with a faint, acrid scent, not quite smoke, not quite perfume, but a mixture that spoke of tension and restraint. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been pushed open in haste or left so by someone trying to maintain privacy. Everett's gaze fell on the small figure inside. She sat near the corner of the room, knees drawn tightly to her chest, arms wrapped protectively around her torso. Her dark brown hair fell messily around her face, partially shielding her eyes but unable to hide the subtle shimmer of unshed tears. The room, bathed in the soft glow of a small lamp, felt impossibly small and suffocating in contrast to the sprawling mansion around them. Her small wrists were visible as she clasped them protectively against her body. And there, faint yet unmistakable, were the marks, tight impressions from a rope that had pressed into her skin, leaving temporary but painfully clear evidence of restraint. Everett's heart lurched as he observed the delicate bruising and redness forming subtle lines around her wrists. These were not just traces of a recent act, they were proof of repeated attempts to control, contain, or punish her, hidden in plain sight until now. The juxtaposition of innocence and injury made the room feel both intimate and alarmingly tense. Everett's mind flooded with memories, times he had been distracted by work calls, urgent meetings, or business trips. Each recollection weighed heavier now, a stark reminder of moments when he had failed to notice her subtle attempts to signal discomfort. He remembered mornings when she had lingered by the hallway silently, the small frown on her face, the hesitations that he had interpreted as childish whim or boredom. Nights when the house was silent, and he assumed she slept peacefully, now replayed in a harsh light. Every overlooked gesture, every missed cue, every assumed contentment had been a missed opportunity to intervene. The marks on her wrists demanded attention, but so did the careful tension in her posture. Everett could see the way her fingers flexed around her arms, the slight quiver in her hands, the controlled sway of her body as she tried to create her own sense of protection within the corner. The scissors she had clutched in previous struggles were absent here, but the signs of restraint were even more profound. Each minute detail, the indentation of the rug beneath her knees, the way she pressed her arms against her torso, the subtle tilt of her head, was a silent testament to the anxiety she had carried, concealed within the walls of a home he had always believed to be safe. Every object in the room seemed to take on new significance. The nightstand, the small lamp, the bed, the chair near the window, each item appeared to mark her territory, a series of physical boundaries she had claimed to protect herself. The lamp cast long, shadowed lines across the floor and walls, emphasizing the tight, protective curvature of her body and the vulnerable posture she had adopted. The small traces of hair across the rug suggested prior struggles, subtle attempts to free herself or adjust her position. Each element told a story he had ignored or assumed was inconsequential, now woven together in a tapestry of fear and silent resistance. Everett knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate to avoid startling her further. His eyes never left the faint rope marks, and his hands hovered near her shoulders, offering presence rather than force. The gravity of the situation was apparent. He had discovered evidence of restraint, fear, and vulnerability, and the immediacy of her emotional state required a careful, measured response. The mansion, with all its grandeur, now felt oppressive, emphasizing the isolation that had contributed to her distress. It was clear that the home, which he had always considered a sanctuary, had unintentionally amplified the dangers of neglect and inattention. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes flicking toward him cautiously, and each subtle movement betrayed a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had endured moments alone, hiding and protecting herself within spaces of her own choosing, and Everett realized how much trust and understanding would be required to bridge the gap that had grown between them. The delicate rope impressions on her wrists were proof not only of physical vulnerability but of the psychological tension she had endured in silence. Every detail, the curve of her small hands, the quiver of her shoulders, the faint sheen of sweat on her forehead, demanded attention, empathy, and deliberate care. Everett's pulse quickened as he processed the scene, the whisper still echoing faintly in his mind. He understood, finally, that his daughter had been communicating in ways beyond words, relying on physical traces, protective postures, and the careful positioning of objects to signal distress. The mansion, expansive and imposing, had created both literal and emotional spaces where her fear could persist unseen. But in this moment, recognition arrived too late to prevent past distress, yet in time to prevent further harm. He notices fresh rope marks on her small wrists, faint but unmistakable. Everett Caldwell's eyes swept across the room, now seeing it through a lens of heightened awareness that illuminated every detail he had previously overlooked. What he had once considered safe, the carefully arranged furniture, the polished floors, the familiar toys, now bore subtle signs of hidden tension and restrained movement. Every object seemed to whisper a story, hinting at the fear and discomfort that had gone unnoticed. The mansion, with all its grandeur, had inadvertently provided a stage for her silent struggles, allowing small traces of restraint and anxiety to remain hidden in plain sight for far too long. The bed, perfectly made earlier in the day, now revealed faint indentations along the edge, small dips that suggested repeated pressure from tiny hands pressing against the sheets in moments of quiet panic. Dust along the nightstand bore subtle smudges, patterns formed by cautious fingers that had brushed the surface in search of stability or comfort. The chair by the window had shifted ever so slightly, leaving marks on the polished floorboards that indicated the deliberate repositioning of her body within the room. Everett recognized each mark as part of a silent narrative, one that required patience and careful observation to interpret fully. He moved closer to the floor, examining the faint strands of hair scattered across the rug. Some were delicate, short snips that suggested attempts to adjust herself or manipulate her environment, while others were longer, as if tugged during moments of tension or nervous energy. These fragments formed a subtle pathway, hinting at her movement across the room, and revealing the intricate choreography of a child attempting to regain control in a space that had often felt too overwhelming. Everett's chest tightened as he realized the depth of her quiet struggle. The objects she interacted with carried equal significance. Hair clips lay scattered in a pattern that suggested repeated manipulation, while a small comb rested askew on the dresser, its teeth slightly bent from use. A tiny toy, ordinarily a source of play, had been nudged against the corner of the bed in a way that indicated protective behavior, a method of marking territory or creating a small barrier. Everett could see that each act was deliberate, and that every object in the room had become part of a complex system through which she expressed discomfort, anxiety, and the need for control. The subtle signs extended beyond the obvious surfaces. He noticed the slight fraying of a ribbon tied to a chair leg, almost imperceptible unless one looked carefully. Its edge bore faint threads pulled and tugged, evidence that she had attempted to manipulate it, perhaps to test boundaries, create leverage, or signal distress. The ribbon, ordinary in appearance, had become part of her vocabulary of silent communication, a physical token marking her effort to assert agency in a world she could not fully control. Everett realized that the small details he had long ignored now formed a crucial map of her emotional state. His eyes scanned the walls, noting faint smudges where she had likely pressed her hands for balance, reassurance, or to create a barrier between herself and perceived threats. Even the shadows played a role in her strategies, with the corners of the room providing the compression and containment she instinctively sought. Everett's mind pieced together the sequence, her path from the bed to the chair, the placement of the comb and clips, the gentle tugging on the ribbon, all actions aimed at regulating herself and seeking comfort while navigating spaces that should have felt safe but did not. He leaned slightly closer to inspect the ribbon, careful not to disturb the delicate evidence of her movements. The fibers were faintly stretched, their wear indicating repeated interaction over time. Everett's heart constricted as he understood the significance. She had not simply been fidgeting or playing, she had been communicating fear, expressing discomfort, and attempting to exert control over her environment using the objects available. Every small mark, every displacement, and every subtle fray told a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of vulnerability. The mansion's atmosphere seemed to shift as he observed these traces. The polished wood floors and muted walls no longer represented order and elegance, they reflected the tension, fear, and resilience of a child navigating an environment that had, until now, gone unexamined. Everett noticed how shadows stretched and pulled across the room, accentuating the subtle markers of her passage and heightening the emotional weight of the scene. The interplay of light and dark seemed almost symbolic, reflecting both the visibility and concealment of her distress. As he moved toward the window, he caught a faint impression on the floor where a small foot had pressed firmly, indicating repeated pauses and hesitations. Each step she had taken was deliberate, balancing caution with the instinct to seek comfort. Everett realized that the mansion, with all its grandeur and space, had amplified both her vulnerability and her resourcefulness, allowing her to create hidden refuges and leave subtle traces for someone observant enough to notice. Every action, every object, and every minor displacement formed a coherent narrative of quiet suffering and adaptive behavior. His gaze returned to the ribbon, now fully appreciating its importance. The frayed edge was more than an incidental wear, it was a signal of her effort to free herself, a tangible representation of her desire for control and autonomy. The ribbon had become a physical message embedded in the room, one that required careful interpretation to fully grasp. Everett understood that these signs were not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern, one that had unfolded over hours, days, or perhaps weeks of silent struggle. The awareness of these details created a tense, charged atmosphere in the room. Everett's pulse quickened as he recognized how much had been missed, how subtly her distress had been expressed, and how urgently intervention was required. The mansion, previously a symbol of security and privilege, now seemed to loom with hidden threats, amplified by neglect and inattention. Each object, every displaced item, every minor mark on the floor or wall became evidence of a child's resilience and ingenuity in seeking safety and comfort in a world that had been oblivious to her struggle. Everett's focus shifted to the overall pattern of movement, from the bed to the chair, to the displaced objects, and finally to the subtle fray of the ribbon. Every detail indicated repeated interaction, careful adjustments, and strategic placement. He realized that the child had been leaving a trail for someone to notice, creating a delicate language through movement and object manipulation. The mansion had inadvertently provided both challenge and canvas, and Everett understood that recognizing and responding to these signals was the first critical step in restoring her safety and trust. A small ribbon frayed at the edge hints she had tried to free herself earlier. Everett Caldwell's eyes scanned the room with an intensity born of mounting dread. Every object, every chair, toy, and piece of furniture now seemed alive with meaning, each carrying the silent imprint of his daughter's fear. What had once been ordinary items now revealed themselves as instruments of coping, defensive markers, and subtle cries for attention. The bedpost, the small desk, the chair tucked slightly off kilter, all of it told the story of a child maneuvering through spaces she had once assumed safe, now navigating a labyrinth of invisible threats. The house itself, vast and imposing, had inadvertently amplified her anxiety, transforming everyday objects into extensions of her internal struggle. He crouched, examining a small wooden chair near the center of the room. Its legs had shifted slightly from the usual placement, leaving faint impressions on the polished floor. Everett noted the tiny scratches along the edge of the chair, barely visible but significant, the traces of her hands gripping, tugging, or pushing for balance. Each mark, subtle yet deliberate, spoke volumes about the tension she carried. Even a simple toy on the shelf revealed layers of meaning, its displacement indicated a moment of self-protection or a strategic adjustment to create a boundary within the room. Dust patterns across the rug provided additional insight. Slight disturbances traced arcs from one corner to another, each curve indicating movement that had been cautious, intentional, and precise. The child had used these motions to navigate a room that, in scale and design, threatened her sense of control. Everett could imagine her small body moving silently, crouching, leaning, and adjusting, while every object became part of her strategy, a barrier, a signal, or a source of tactile comfort. The furniture was no longer static, it became an active participant in her method of coping, responding to her movements and reinforcing her fragile sense of safety. A small table near the window drew Everett's attention next. On it lay a few scattered objects, a hairbrush, a ribbon, and a toy figurine, each disturbed in a way that was anything but accidental. The brush had been moved repeatedly, strands of hair caught in its bristles suggesting moments of tension and self-soothing. The ribbon's faint fraying hinted at repeated handling, tugged in efforts to create comfort or exert control. The toy, tipped on its side, indicated deliberate placement, forming a small barrier or protective zone. Everett realized that each object carried a dual narrative, both a practical role in her immediate environment and a symbolic reflection of her emotional state. Even the larger furniture, dresser drawers, bedposts, and shelving units, bore subtle evidence of her presence. Slight scuffs along the edges, faint fingerprints in dust, and tiny indentations on polished surfaces suggested careful interaction. Each trace was deliberate, movements designed to assert control, create stability, and communicate distress without words. Everett's chest tightened as he understood the depth of her struggle. The room was no longer merely a bedroom, but a landscape of fear, resilience, and silent messaging. The objects were her medium, and he was only beginning to decode the language embedded in their placement and condition. The faint scratches along the floorboards suggested repeated motions, small steps, cautious shifts in posture, and adjustments to maintain proximity to perceived safety. Everett noted the subtle evidence of her routine. She had carefully measured each movement, mapping the terrain to ensure her ability to retreat or protect herself at a moment's notice. Every chair, rug, and small table had become a landmark in this silent map of survival, each object imbued with the memory of fear, careful deliberation, and the instinct to shield herself. He moved toward the dresser, noting the subtle displacement of its contents. Hair clips were no longer neatly lined, a small comb lay askew with slight breaks in its teeth. These minor disruptions were not careless, they were traces of coping, evidence of repeated attempts to assert control over a world that felt overwhelming. Everett's gaze lingered on each object, realizing that they collectively told a story more vivid than words alone could convey. She had left a trail of evidence, a narrative woven through the room itself, of fear, resilience, and the strategies she had adopted to navigate it. Even the shadows seemed to participate. The dim light from the bedside lamp cast elongated shapes across the furniture, emphasizing gaps, edges, and corners where she had likely sought refuge. Everett's eyes followed the subtle gradients of light and dark, noting areas where dust had shifted or objects had been nudged into alignment. The interplay of illumination and shadow revealed the hidden choreography of her movements, showing how she had occupied the room in deliberate ways, constantly adjusting to the demands of her emotional landscape. As he studied the room, Everett's attention fell on the smallest details, a faint smear on the side of a toy shelf, a tiny indentation in the rug beneath the desk, and a slightly tilted chair near the wall. Each trace was a testament to repeated activity, reflecting her need for tactile reassurance and the creation of boundaries within a space that otherwise felt uncontrollable. He realized that the objects were not passive, they had been co-opted into her system of coping, bearing silent witness to her fear, her ingenuity, and her resilience. Everett's mind traced the possible sequence of events. She had moved through the room, interacting with each object to manage discomfort, regulate emotions, and maintain a sense of safety. Every placement, shift, and disturbance had been intentional, forming a continuous story embedded in the very environment. The mansion, grand and imposing, had unintentionally provided both obstacles and tools, shaping her navigation and leaving behind a trail of subtle clues that required careful observation to interpret. Finally, his gaze swept toward the far corner of the room, where the dust was faintly disturbed and objects aligned in a subtle pattern. The marks indicated movement toward another part of the house, suggesting that her journey had not ended here. Everett's pulse quickened as he followed the trajectory, understanding that she had been creating a pathway through familiar objects to manage fear, assert control, and seek a refuge in spaces that offered comfort and concealment. A faint trail of disturbed dust leads toward the basement. Everett Caldwell froze for a moment as he traced the faint trail of disturbed dust and small objects toward the basement. The quiet of the mansion, once a comfort, now felt oppressive, each echo and creak amplified by the gravity of realization. He remembered countless moments he had overlooked, early mornings when she had lingered silently in the hallway, the slight hesitation of her hand reaching for a toy or object, the subtle curl of her lips betraying discomfort. At the time, he had assumed these gestures were insignificant or the product of childish play, yet now each memory hit him with the weight of missed signals. Flashbacks assaulted him in rapid succession, unrelenting in their clarity. Late nights when he had been buried in emails or conference calls replayed vividly, his mind unable to reconcile the distance he had allowed to grow. He remembered walking past her room after long meetings, seeing her curled on the bed or quietly shifting items around her small desk, and believing she was content, safe, or merely occupied. The mansion, with its wide halls and imposing rooms, had always seemed like a sanctuary, yet it had masked the subtle manifestations of her anxiety. Everett realized with a sinking heart that every unattended call for help, every overlooked gesture, had compounded her fear and left her isolated. The memory of a recent morning struck him most sharply. He had been in a rush, briefcase in hand, glancing into her room only briefly before assuming she was ready for school. She had sat on the edge of her bed, head lowered, hands twisting a hair ribbon in nervous repetition. He had smiled absent-mindedly and hurried on, unaware that each movement was a carefully orchestrated attempt to manage discomfort, a silent effort to create order in a room that felt too large and unmanageable. These small, repeated acts, ribbon twisted, hair adjusted, objects nudged, were part of a continuum of coping, and he had missed every signal until now. The mansion itself seemed to weigh on him as he remembered nights he had returned late, assuming all was well. The expansive spaces, polished floors, and echoing halls had amplified the illusion of calm, yet in every shadow, every corner, subtle signs had been present. Small smudges in dust, displaced toys, and hair scattered across the floor had all been breadcrumbs of her struggle. Everett's eyes traced each detail in memory, realizing that these were not isolated incidents but part of a repeated pattern, a series of silent communications that demanded his attention yet went unheeded until this very moment. He recalled afternoons when she had attempted to engage with him, quietly adjusting her hair, moving toys to specific positions, or rearranging small items around the house. Each gesture had been deliberate, aimed at asserting some control or signaling discomfort, yet he had misinterpreted them as idle play. Everett felt the surge of guilt and urgency, the bitter recognition that his ambition, travel, and work had created gaps in observation that left her to navigate fear alone. He now understood that these memories, once fleeting and easily dismissed, were critical in understanding the path she had taken through her own quiet struggle. Everett's gaze fell to the floor, observing the faint, almost imperceptible shifts in the dust that echoed patterns he remembered seeing in his flashbacks. He realized that every subtle movement she had made in past hours and days, small footsteps along hallways, nudges of furniture, rearranged objects, was a meticulously constructed map designed to navigate the mansion safely while avoiding fear. The weight of these overlooked signals pressed heavily on him, a reminder of both her vulnerability and her resilience in the face of sustained neglect. He replayed moments of distraction from weeks prior, work calls that had pulled him away from attention, meetings that had consumed hours he might have spent noticing subtle distress, and evenings when he assumed silence meant peace. Every instance became a stark reminder of his absence, each gap in his presence magnified in the context of the tiny body navigating fear alone. The mansion's wide corridors, open spaces, and polished floors, previously symbols of security and wealth, had inadvertently contributed to the child's isolation, providing expansive hiding spaces and amplifying the impact of his inattentiveness. The culmination of these memories became undeniable as Everett's gaze fell on the floor near the basement entrance. A tiny footprint, delicate and precise, appeared in the dust where he had believed she was safe hours ago. It was the physical manifestation of all the subtle gestures, movements, and signs he had ignored, a reminder that her body had moved independently to seek refuge, escape fear, or assert control. The footprint was stark evidence that the child had been acting deliberately within the mansion, using its spaces strategically to manage tension and maintain some semblance of safety. Everett's chest tightened as he absorbed the significance of the footprint. It confirmed the pattern he had begun to discern, a calculated series of movements designed to navigate the mansion's vast interior while mitigating exposure to anxiety and fear. Every detail, from displaced objects to hair strands and subtle dust smudges, now converged into a coherent narrative. The mansion had not been the passive backdrop he assumed, it had interacted with her actions, shaping her choices and defining the paths she took to preserve safety and control. His mind returned to the fleeting gestures of previous days, hands twisting ribbons, objects nudged for balance, and faint marks on walls and furniture indicating careful negotiation with space. Everett understood that her movements were deliberate communications, a silent cry for acknowledgement that had gone unnoticed until now. The footprint at the basement entrance was both a literal and symbolic marker, connecting past neglect with present urgency. It underscored the delicate and calculated nature of her navigation and emphasized how his absence had forced her to rely on ingenuity to manage fear. The mansion's shadowed corners seemed to deepen in significance as Everett traced the footprint's direction. It was not merely an imprint, it was a declaration of movement, a marker of survival, and a silent plea for understanding. Every previous flashback, every overlooked gesture, every ignored signal had converged in this single moment of revelation. Everett felt the pressing responsibility of recognition and response, realizing that he must act swiftly and with precision to bridge the gap between fear and trust, and to ensure her safety moving forward. A tiny footprint appears where he thought she was safe hours ago. Everett Caldwell's eyes swept across the mansion with an urgency that heightened every detail. The vastness of the home, once a symbol of comfort and status, now revealed itself as a network of potential hiding spaces, corners where his daughter had sought sanctuary from the threats she feared. Each nook, closet, and shadowed area carried subtle signs of her presence, displaced objects, faint impressions on rugs, hair strands, and marks in dust that testified to her deliberate movements. Everett realized with a chilling clarity that she had navigated these spaces with precision, creating small sanctuaries to assert control and shield herself from harm. The first area he examined was the corner behind the bookcase in her bedroom. Faint impressions in the carpet suggested repeated use, while dust on the nearby furniture had been lightly brushed, likely by her small hands seeking balance or reassurance. The space itself was cramped, offering protection from sightlines and movement in the rest of the room. Everett imagined her curling herself into the shadows, pressing her back against the wall, and clutching a small object, a hairclip or piece of ribbon, for comfort. The corner had become more than a hiding place. It was a personal refuge, a microcosm of safety amidst a house that had long overlooked her vulnerability. He moved down the hallway, noting subtle changes in the alignment of furniture. Chairs slightly shifted, rugs subtly displaced, and faint streaks in dust indicated a careful navigation of space. Everett recognized that she had moved deliberately, choosing areas where her small frame could be concealed and where she could maintain a sense of control. The mansion's grand design, intended to impress and facilitate life, had inadvertently created zones that allowed a child to isolate herself, and she had mastered the art of seeking them out. Each location bore the imprint of her emotional intelligence, the instinctive selection of spaces that minimized exposure, maximized comfort, and allowed her to survive moments of fear without detection. The study, once considered a place of work and order, revealed additional signs. Subtle smudges along the edges of shelves, small hair strands on the rug, and the displacement of a few papers suggested repeated pauses, careful crouching, and attempts to remain unseen. Everett's pulse quickened as he visualized her navigating this area, slipping quietly behind the furniture, curling herself into tight spaces, and relying on tactile contact with surfaces to maintain grounding. Each subtle movement had been a strategy, a protective choreography executed by a child whose fear required constant vigilance and whose ingenuity enabled survival. Everett's attention shifted to a small closet near the staircase. The door, slightly ajar, revealed faintly disturbed items inside. A row of neatly stacked boxes shifted, a few coats slightly out of alignment, and a soft indentation in the corner of the floor. The closet offered both concealment and a sense of enclosure, compressing space to provide psychological comfort. Everett imagined her crouched inside, back pressed against the wall, knees drawn to chest, clutching a ribbon or small toy for reassurance. The space had been deliberately chosen for its ability to create a sense of safety while remaining hidden, a refuge from the expansive, intimidating environment that otherwise dominated the mansion. The attic staircase drew his gaze next. Faint marks on the steps, displaced blankets, and hair strands indicated she had used the transition between rooms strategically, moving deliberately from one safe zone to another. Everett realized that her path was carefully calculated, designed to maintain control while minimizing exposure. Every stop, every pause, every careful adjustment of objects had purpose. The mansion, with its open hallways, high ceilings, and polished floors, had amplified her need for small, controlled spaces where she could regulate fear, calm herself, and prepare for the next movement. He then examined the laundry room, the shadows thick and dim. The floor bore subtle impressions of small feet, faintly curved and deliberate, tracing a route from one corner to the door and back. Dust along the edges had been brushed in arcs, indicating repeated crouching or kneeling. And there, partially concealed behind the door, lay a rope coil, abandoned yet speaking volumes about her prior efforts to resist restraint. Its presence confirmed what Everett had feared. She had not only been seeking refuge but had also encountered tangible objects associated with fear or harm, and her choice of space had been both protective and strategic. Everett's mind raced as he connected the dots. Every corner, every nook, and every closet she had chosen told a story of calculated avoidance and survival. The mansion's vastness, once a symbol of safety, had created opportunities for isolation and concealment. She had instinctively found spaces that provided security, shielding herself from both physical and emotional threats. Objects in her immediate environment had been transformed into tools for protection, and the layout of the house had inadvertently guided her movement patterns, emphasizing her resourcefulness and need for control. The subtle signs were everywhere. Faint hair strands, tiny scuff marks, displaced objects, and indented rugs created a map of her behavior, illustrating the locations she had claimed as personal territories. Everett understood that each choice was deliberate. The corners offered safety, the closets provided enclosure, and the hidden spaces allowed her to exert autonomy over a world that often felt too large and threatening. He realized the magnitude of her ingenuity and the depth of fear she had endured silently. Every movement through the mansion was a performance of careful survival. Everett noted how she had balanced proximity to light and shadow, her choices dictated by both psychological and environmental factors. Each corner represented both concealment and control, a microcosm of her autonomy in a space that had long overlooked her needs. Everett's attention to detail revealed the subtle choreography of her refuge-seeking, and he felt the urgency of intervention. Recognition alone would not suffice. He needed to restore safety, trust, and reassurance. The evidence culminated in the laundry room, where the abandoned rogue coil rested near the edge of the doorway. Its presence marked the intensity of her prior encounters, the tangible danger she had faced, and her persistent attempts to reclaim control. Everett's heart tightened as he understood that the child's choice of space was both strategic and necessary. It had allowed her to maintain a fragile sense of autonomy while minimizing exposure to fear or harm. The room itself had become an extension of her coping mechanism, a controlled environment where she could navigate distress with careful calculation. Behind the laundry room door, a rope coil lies abandoned. Everett Caldwell's gaze swept over the room with a precision born of urgency and guilt. Objects that had once seemed ordinary, hairbrushes, small rugs, toys, and trinkets, now revealed themselves as carriers of silent communication, each bearing marks of struggle, self-soothing, or escape. The child's daily environment, previously overlooked, was now a record of repeated efforts to navigate fear and assert control. Every item, no matter how mundane, told a story. The hairbrush where strands had become caught, the rug slightly displaced from repeated kneeling or crouching, the toy nudged aside to create small protective zones. The familiar had become evidence of resilience and distress interwoven into the fabric of her daily life. Everett crouched to inspect a small hairbrush lying near the edge of the rug. Its bristles were worn unevenly, laden with a few strands of hair, bent slightly from repeated pressure. The signs were subtle, almost imperceptible unless one was looking closely, yet they spoke volumes. This brush had been used over and over, a tool for both grooming and self-regulation, manipulated in moments of tension, anxiety, or fear. He could imagine her small hands pressing into it, adjusting strands, tugging lightly to relieve discomfort, or gripping it tightly to anchor herself amid emotional overwhelm. Each micro-movement, repeated countless times, had left a trace, evidence of a struggle that was otherwise invisible. Nearby, a small rug had been nudged slightly from its usual alignment. Everett traced faint impressions along the edge, revealing where tiny knees had pressed repeatedly. Dust had been brushed subtly in arcs, perhaps to create a pathway or to maintain balance during careful movements. The rug, ordinary to an adult eye, had functioned as both surface and marker, a stage for repeated acts of resilience, self-expression, and quiet negotiation with fear. Even a simple toy, tipped from its position on a low shelf, revealed purposeful manipulation, suggesting attempts to create space, block line of sight, or mark territory as a refuge. Objects on the dresser told a similar story. Hair clips, once neatly arranged, were scattered with intent. Some had small scratches, others were bent or slightly twisted from repeated handling. Each clip seemed to serve as both tool and talisman, an anchor to provide tactile comfort, a method of exerting minor control over her immediate environment. The drawer beneath contained a comb, its teeth subtly broken along one side, evidence of repeated pressure applied with small hands. Everett understood that these ordinary items had been transformed into instruments of survival, each playing a critical role in her management of fear and discomfort. The traces extended beyond objects and into the subtle environment itself. Faint smudges on the floor and walls indicated deliberate contact, small hands pressed against surfaces for reassurance, nudges along edges for balance or control, even slight shifts in furniture suggesting repeated interaction. Everett noticed how the child had converted everyday items and spaces into a network of markers, guiding her movements, creating protective barriers, and establishing zones of relative safety within the vast mansion. These signs revealed both ingenuity and a persistent need to assert autonomy despite her vulnerability. Even the smallest objects revealed a pattern. A small ribbon, partially frayed, had been twisted repeatedly and left snagged on the handle of a drawer. Its placement, deliberate and precise, suggested both struggle and strategy, a tiny effort to remove a constraint, signal distress, or maintain a tactile connection to comfort. Everett's heart tightened as he realized the significance. This ribbon, insignificant to an unobservant eye, was a tangible symbol of repeated effort and subtle communication, an artifact of her survival tactics embedded in the mundane rhythm of daily life. The room's ordinary surfaces, desks, nightstands, shelves, had become active participants in her coping. Slightly displaced objects, small scratches, hair strands caught in bristles or fabrics, and faint impressions in dust created a network of evidence, illustrating how she had navigated fear and exerted control in constrained ways. Everett traced the sequence: hairbrush to rug, comb to drawer, ribbon to floor. Each object had a role, forming a coherent pattern that revealed her movements, intentions, and strategies. The ordinary environment, previously overlooked, had become a living record of her repeated attempts to protect herself and communicate distress. Everett reflected on the weight of oversight. His attention had always been fragmented: work calls, meetings, business travel, but the mansion's everyday spaces had carried subtle, persistent signals of distress. He now recognized that her interaction with objects had been deliberate, strategic, and remarkably consistent. Every hairbrush, every small rug, every ribbon told the story of a child negotiating fear, marking territory, and attempting to maintain autonomy in a household that had inadvertently neglected her signals. The accumulation of these traces formed a map leading to the most revealing evidence. Dust disturbed in arcs, objects nudged aside, and frayed ribbons created a path extending beyond the bedroom. Everett noticed a faint trajectory toward the hallway, guiding attention to other areas where she might have sought refuge. The ordinary objects, transformed into carriers of fear and silent communication, provided a breadcrumb trail through which he could reconstruct her experience, understand her needs, and, ultimately, intervene. He approached the dresser carefully, eyeing the partially frayed ribbon hanging from the handle. Its threads were faintly pulled and twisted, evidence that she had attempted to free herself or use the object for comfort. Everett understood immediately: this ribbon was not incidental. It was a trace of her repeated struggle, a marker of resilience, and a signpost of her ongoing effort to navigate fear. The evidence embedded in everyday life had illuminated the hidden depth of her experience, and the ribbon on the drawer handle was the most immediate and tangible indicator that her struggle had been active, deliberate, and continuous. A torn piece of ribbon caught on a drawer handle hints at her struggle. Everett Caldwell descended the narrow staircase into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. The dim light from the small overhead bulb flickered across the concrete walls, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and shift like silent sentinels. He immediately sensed the dual nature of the space. It was both confining and protective, oppressive yet strangely controlled. The basement had become her sanctuary and her prison, a place where fear and strategy intertwined. Every step Everett took echoed faintly, yet the quiet had a weight, amplified by the knowledge of her repeated visits to this cold, shadowed environment. The floor beneath him revealed traces of her careful navigation. Faint dust smudges, impressions in the concrete, and subtle movements of small objects indicated a calculated path through the basement. Each mark was evidence of her presence, a silent record of repeated visits, deliberate pauses, and attempts to maintain control in a space that could easily become overwhelming. Everett noted how she had used the shadows, corners, and objects strategically, creating zones of protection in the harsh geometry of the basement. Even the chill of the concrete seemed to have been mitigated by her instinctive positioning, her small body seeking contact with walls or the floor to anchor herself. He moved closer to a cluster of crates along one wall, their surfaces lightly dusted and scuffed. The crates had been nudged slightly from their original positions, creating small enclosures or hiding spots within the larger basement. Everett could imagine her moving among them, crouching behind one, pressing her back against another, and relying on the enclosed spaces to maintain a sense of security. The careful arrangement suggested repeated use, a practiced choreography of concealment. Every nudge, every scuff, every tiny displacement was a record of her fear, ingenuity, and need for control within an environment that had been both imposing and necessary for her emotional regulation. Objects scattered across the floor provided additional evidence. A rope, previously unnoticed, lay coiled in a corner, abandoned but signaling past distress. Small toys and household items had been displaced subtly, forming a network of markers she could use to navigate the basement with minimal exposure. Everett observed the imprints on the floor, the faint arcs of knees or hands pressing lightly into dust, and understood that each trace was a deliberate attempt to maintain control while seeking refuge. The basement's cold concrete, harsh lighting, and shadows had been transformed into a carefully monitored terrain of safety. Everett's attention turned to the walls, where subtle smudges indicated moments of tactile contact. She had pressed her hands against surfaces for stability, reassurance, or orientation, leaving faint traces that required careful observation to detect. Every corner revealed a pattern of repeated interactions, her small hands brushing dust, objects nudged into alignment, and spaces compressed to provide containment. The basement, while physically imposing, had been co-opted into her system of coping, a controlled environment that allowed her to navigate fear and maintain autonomy despite her vulnerability. The air in the basement carried the faint scent of dust and cold concrete, mingling with a subtler trace of lingering warmth from her small body. Everett noted how the lighting accentuated every corner, every crate, and every object, casting shadows that she had likely used for concealment. The interaction of light and darkness in the basement created a rhythm of safety and exposure, a landscape she had learned to manipulate with care. Everett's heart tightened as he realized the sophistication of her strategy. She had adapted to this harsh environment, repeatedly returning to it not out of preference but necessity, finding within its shadows the only measure of control she could claim. He bent closer to inspect the floor near one of the crates. The faintest of marks, a shallow indentation in the dust, revealed where her body had pressed against the floor or wall. Small smudges and a subtle shift of objects suggested she had crouched low, creating a temporary barrier from the rest of the basement. Each trace was evidence of deliberate concealment, a child balancing vulnerability with resourcefulness. Everett could almost visualize her movements, the careful negotiation of space, the strategic placement of objects, and the subtle use of shadows and corners to maintain a sense of safety. Even the smallest details conveyed significance. A hair strand caught along the edge of a crate, the slight disarray of a discarded toy, and the faint dragging of a rug across the floor created a physical record of repeated actions. Everett noted how these minor, almost imperceptible signs mapped her path through the basement, tracing both her attempts to escape perceived threats and her efforts to create a controlled microenvironment. Each object, each mark, and each movement reflected her silent communication, her resilience, and her instinct for self-preservation. As Everett traced the trail deeper into the basement, he noticed a subtle variation in the dust and debris on the floor. There were faint impressions that indicated hesitation and retreat, small pauses suggesting vigilance, assessment, or cautious monitoring of the space. She had been deliberate in her actions, balancing her need for concealment with the need to navigate the basement efficiently. Everett recognized that the basement had become both prison and sanctuary, a harsh, unyielding environment adapted into a domain she could manage, control, and survive within. Finally, his eyes landed on the corner beyond the row of crates. Faint scratches and subtle smudges indicated where she had pressed against a surface, likely attempting to remain unseen while observing her surroundings. Every shift in dust, every small displacement, every interaction with the physical objects formed a silent narrative, a story written in the very environment she occupied. The basement was no longer a mere storage space, it had become a canvas upon which her strategies for survival and self-preservation were meticulously recorded. Faint marks on a crate suggest she tried to hide from someone. Everett Caldwell moved slowly through the basement, his eyes scanning every corner, crate, and surface with the precision of someone piecing together a puzzle. The faint marks in dust, the subtle scuffs on the concrete floor, and the carefully displaced objects created a silent story, one written entirely through motion rather than words. Each step she had taken, each crouch, and each adjustment of furniture or objects was a deliberate act of communication. Everett realized that the child had left a language behind in the physical world, gestures and movements that conveyed her fear, her need for control, and her desperate attempts to create order within chaos. He crouched low, examining the faint indentations along the floor. Tiny footprints led in arcs and curves, suggesting deliberate pauses, cautious assessments of the surroundings, and strategic retreats to hidden corners. Dust had been brushed aside in small sweeping motions, creating subtle pathways through which she had navigated the basement. Everett traced the flow of movement with his eyes, imagining the child shifting from crate to crate, crouching behind objects, and using every element of the environment as a tool to manage anxiety. Each subtle mark spoke of a meticulous and instinctive system, a choreography of survival that demanded patient observation to decode. Objects bore witness to her silent communication. A small doll had been nudged slightly toward a wall, a rope coil shifted imperceptibly, and a blanket folded against the base of a crate suggested repeated use as a barrier. Hair clips and a few scattered toys showed evidence of repeated manipulation, perhaps held tightly to calm her, perhaps placed as markers of space she controlled. Everett noted how each object, though ordinary in isolation, contributed to a larger narrative when considered together. The basement had become her medium, her canvas, and her diary, a space where her body and environment spoke in tandem, conveying emotions too complex for words. Everett's gaze followed subtle traces along the wall. Smudges indicated where small hands had pressed, pushing dust aside or using the wall as a guide for stability. The placement of items and the patterns in the dust were deliberate. Curves, arcs, and shifts reflected pauses and movements intended to create shelter, establish boundaries, and signal internal states. Everett could almost see her tiny body moving through these spaces, crouched low, back pressed against crates, carefully adjusting objects and watching for changes in the environment. Each motion communicated not only fear but also resilience, adaptability, and ingenuity. He paused at a corner where the dust was faintly disturbed, revealing a subtle trail toward a small crate stacked near the wall. Here, the intensity of her movement became evident. Repeated touches, slight adjustments, and the careful placement of objects suggested that she had been attempting more than just concealment. Everett understood that these motions were her language, a silent record of her efforts to communicate distress, assert control, and establish temporary security in a world that had overlooked her signals for too long. Every detail mattered, dust brushed in deliberate arcs, hair strands caught on edges, and tiny shifts of toys and blankets formed patterns that revealed timing, sequence, and intent. Everett observed the interplay between motion and environment, recognizing that the child had learned to use every aspect of the basement, its crates, shadows, walls, and floor, to express what she could not say. The physical evidence was as expressive as any words could be, capturing her fear, the need for autonomy, and her efforts to find safe zones within the house. The spatial narrative extended beyond a single corner. Everett traced the movement patterns toward another part of the basement, noting how objects were repositioned to facilitate hiding, balance, and communication. He realized that her interactions had been consistent, deliberate, and meaningful, hair clips placed as markers, blankets folded as soft boundaries, and toys nudged to create symbolic protection. Each act of motion was a deliberate message, a way of asserting agency in an environment that often left her feeling powerless. Even the smallest gestures revealed intention. A faint drag mark on the floor suggested she had adjusted a blanket or rope coil, not by accident, but to create an obstacle, a point of separation, or a moment of comfort. Dust smudges indicated repeated kneeling, hands pressing lightly to steady herself, or movements designed to create a sense of order and control. Everett recognized the sophistication of her actions. The child had embedded a complex narrative in her motions, requiring attentive observation to reconstruct her emotional experience. Objects revealed layers of meaning beyond their immediate function. Toys, ribbons, hairbrushes, and even rope coils were transformed into instruments of communication. They marked zones of safety, indicated past struggles, and provided subtle clues about her mental and emotional state. Everett pieced together the story encoded in these interactions, a child navigating fear, using the physical world to convey need, and leaving traces meant for careful eyes to discover. The basement, once perceived as empty and impersonal, became a map of resilience, strategy, and silent expression. Finally, Everett noticed the most significant clue, a small notebook tucked partially beneath a crate. Its cover was worn, edges frayed, and pages filled with hurried sketches, depicting her movements, objects, and spaces within the basement. The drawings translated motion into visual representation, revealing her inner turmoil and providing insight into the emotional strategies she had employed. Everett understood that this notebook was the culmination of all her messages written in motion, a tangible record of fear, resilience, and communication. A notebook with hurried sketches reveals her silent cries. Everett Caldwell paused in the center of the basement, the flickering overhead light casting shifting shadows across the concrete walls. His gaze lingered on the scattered objects, the faint footprints in dust, and the notebook filled with hurried sketches. The truth crystallized with painful clarity. His daughter's whispered plea, "Please don't tie me again," was not about defiance or misbehavior. It was not a protest against rules or a desire for control over trivial matters. It was a profound statement of fear, autonomy, and the need for safety, an urgent declaration that she had been overpowered in ways she could neither fully articulate nor trust adults to comprehend. Every trace of her movement now spoke a language he had only just begun to understand. The displaced toys, hair strands, and scuffed rugs were not random. They were part of a deliberate system she had developed to navigate spaces fraught with threat and anxiety. The notebooks and sketches mapped her emotional strategies, documenting spaces of refuge, moments of retreat, and areas where she could exercise control. Everett realized that she had been trying to communicate a hierarchy of fear and comfort, an intricate method to survive in a world where her autonomy had been compromised. He reflected on the symbolism embedded in her movements. Every crouch behind a crate, every carefully folded blanket, every nudged object was a calculated effort to create a perimeter of safety around herself. The basement, cold and shadowed, had become both prison and sanctuary. It offered physical enclosure, yet it also revealed the emotional landscape she had navigated, fear mixed with ingenuity, vulnerability balanced with resilience. Each trace was evidence of her capacity to adapt, and Everett felt a growing urgency to understand these signs fully before she moved again. As he scanned the room, Everett recognized how much he had misunderstood before. He had assumed silence meant contentment, that a tidy room reflected calm. Now, every imperfection, every disarrayed object, every slight displacement of dust told a different story. The whispers, the rope marks, the scattered hair, and the strategic placement of toys revealed her coping strategies in a world she had found unsafe at times. Everett's mind replayed the missed signals, times when she had lingered in hallways, rearranged objects quietly, or sought corners to shield herself. Each moment he had overlooked now gained devastating significance. He bent closer to the notebook, running a careful gaze over its pages. The sketches were hurried but precise, mapping her movements through the basement and other rooms. Lines indicated paths, small shapes represented objects she had interacted with, and the arrangement reflected both her physical and emotional strategies. Everett realized that her silent cries were embedded in every detail, every line, mark, and placement was intentional. She had found a way to make her fear legible without words, to create a map of survival that only someone truly attentive could decipher. The gravity of the realization weighed heavily on him. Her whispered plea, once dismissed as minor or inconsequential, now represented a lifetime of subtle signals, small interventions, and desperate attempts to assert agency. Everett's heart tightened as he absorbed the depth of her vulnerability and resilience. She had navigated spaces both familiar and threatening with an intelligence shaped by fear, leaving a record of her experience in the very environment around her. The basement, previously neutral, had become a canvas for her survival, a space where silence and motion communicated truths adults had ignored. As he followed the path she had traced, Everett noticed how meticulously she had adapted to her environment. Shadows, corners, crates, and objects had all been manipulated to maximize control and minimize exposure. Every footstep and movement reflected a careful negotiation with fear, demonstrating an instinctive understanding of space, threat, and personal boundaries. The basement was no longer just a room, it was a repository of her strategies, a map of her autonomy, and a record of resilience embedded in physical traces and objects. Despite the clarity, a wave of urgency surged through Everett. He had begun to interpret the physical language of her fear, but the immediate crisis was now evident. She was no longer present in the basement where he had expected to find her. Every object, every trace, and every sketch served as markers of movement, yet the child herself had vanished, leaving only the signs of her deliberate navigation. Everett felt the weight of responsibility. Her absence underscored the consequences of inattention and the critical need to restore safety and reassurance before she moved further into hidden spaces. The scattered traces created a map leading toward uncertainty. Dust patterns shifted subtly toward staircases and hallways, suggesting her recent movement. Objects displaced along the path reflected careful manipulation, indicating attempts to conceal herself or maintain control over her immediate surroundings. Everett's pulse quickened as he pieced together the clues. She had moved deliberately, seeking the next refuge in her network of controlled spaces. Every detail he had observed now became a thread in a larger tapestry of survival, one that demanded careful attention to prevent further distress. The basement, once the focus of his search, now represented both the known and unknown. It had revealed her strategies, her resilience, and the intelligence with which she had navigated fear. Yet its emptiness emphasized the uncertainty. A space meticulously mapped by her presence now lacked the living, breathing evidence of the child herself. Everett's gaze moved from dust patterns to crates, blankets, and toys, understanding that her disappearance did not signify absence from the home but rather continued adaptation and strategic concealment. Everett's awareness sharpened. He now understood that her whispered plea, "Please don't tie me again," was a manifestation of a broader need: safety, autonomy, and protection from forces she could not control. The physical traces left behind, the footprints, displaced objects, frayed ribbons, and sketches, were her method of expressing vulnerability and maintaining agency. The basement had been both classroom and diary, teaching him how she had endured fear and recorded it through movement and interaction with her environment. She has vanished from the basement, leaving only scattered traces. Everett Caldwell moved carefully through the mansion, his senses attuned to every detail, every subtle clue that might reveal his daughter's path. The basement had yielded fragments of her presence, dust impressions, displaced objects, rope fibers, and faint footprints, but now the 1,000 words search required him to reconstruct the sequence of her movement across the sprawling interior of the home. Each hallway, corridor, and shadowed corner carried silent testimony of her careful navigation, her attempts to remain unseen, and her strategies to maintain a fragile sense of control. The polished floors reflected dim light, highlighting small imperfections and irregularities that had previously gone unnoticed. A stray strand of hair led toward the hallway, and near it, a small ribbon frayed at the edges, evidence of repeated handling. Everett followed these minute signs with intense focus, recognizing that each trace was a deliberate part of her silent communication. Every object, from a tipped-over toy to a slightly shifted chair, had been manipulated to create protective spaces or markers along her path. In this way, the mansion itself became a canvas, recording her fear, her resilience, and her ingenuity in surviving unseen. He paused in the hallway, noting dust lightly brushed in arcs across the floor. These arcs indicated her careful movement from corner to corner, her body bending, crouching, or leaning as she calculated the safest route. The faint scratches near the baseboard suggested moments of pause, likely times when she had assessed the environment for perceived threats or sought brief grounding. Everett understood the sophistication of her strategy. A small child had transformed ordinary household surfaces into tools for communication, navigation, and self-preservation, encoding a narrative through motion that only an attentive observer could decipher. Objects along the hallway further corroborated the trail. Hair clips, slightly out of place, marked stopping points. A small toy nudged against the wall signaled a temporary boundary. Even a discarded sock provided insight into her movement and the areas she had claimed for safety. Everett noted how each displacement aligned with his mental map of her path, a deliberate, sequential journey through spaces that could be controlled, monitored, or avoided depending on her perception of safety. The mansion's architecture, previously neutral, now seemed to dictate her choices, offering both concealment and exposure, shaping her route through careful adaptation. The faint trail of rope fibers led toward the staircase. Everett's pulse quickened as he realized that these fibers were a residual clue from her prior attempts to resist restraint or navigate constrained spaces. They had been inadvertently left behind, yet their presence told him much about her strategy. The objects she carried or touched had served multiple purposes: markers, anchors, and tactile reassurance, all guiding her through the vast interior. Every fiber, every smudge, and every object placement was part of a larger story she had written in motion, and Everett now read it with urgent attention. As he ascended the staircase, the shadows deepened, and the narrow corridors amplified every creak, every soft shift of air. The faint rustling of fabric and subtle disturbances in dust suggested that she had moved carefully, deliberately, and with awareness of his presence. Everett traced these signs with painstaking attention, observing the alignment of objects, the small indentations along the floor, and the nuanced shifts in the environment. Each detail conveyed her intelligence, resilience, and the desperate need for autonomy in spaces that had long failed to provide comfort or security. Reaching the upper hallway, he noted how subtle imprints in the carpet indicated pauses and cautious glances toward light sources, windows, and doors. Hair strands and small debris provided additional context, marking stopping points where she likely adjusted her body or recalibrated her movements. Everett's mind reconstructed the path: basement to hallway, careful navigation along the upper corridor, strategic use of shadow and distance to remain unseen, and deliberate manipulation of the objects she encountered. The mansion, once merely a residence, had become an intricate stage where her motions encoded fear, adaptation, and survival. He slowed near the attic entrance, where faint disturbances in dust, a slightly shifted chair, and an abandoned scarf formed the final markers along her trail. The space beneath the hatch had been used as a transitional zone, offering concealment while allowing observation of his movements below. Everett understood that she had anticipated someone might follow the subtle signs she left, moving with both caution and strategy. Every footstep, every touched object, and every displacement carried meaning. The child had transformed her environment into a coded map, and he was now retracing it with urgency and precision. The attic hatch loomed before him, partially open. Dust disturbed along the edges of the staircase suggested her recent passage, and faint fibers indicated she had brushed against the railing or steps. Everett's chest tightened as he recognized that the culmination of her path was near, yet the final destination remained uncertain. Every element, the hair strands, rope fibers, shifted objects, and disturbances in dust, formed a narrative that demanded his attention, each a piece of the puzzle he had only recently begun to interpret fully. He paused, listening intently. The mansion's silence amplified the faintest of sounds: the subtle creak of wood, a whisper of fabric against concrete, and finally, a soft rustle emanating from the attic hatch. Everett's heart raced. The signals were no longer abstract or indirect. They were immediate, tangible, and alive, pointing to the precise location where she now waited, concealed but perceptibly near. The culmination of his careful following of traces, motion patterns, and displaced objects had brought him to the threshold of her hidden space, where the next moment would determine whether he could reconnect before fear took hold again. A faint rustle comes from the attic hatch. Everett Caldwell stepped cautiously through the upper floors of the mansion, his senses stretched taut with anticipation. Every room, every corner, and every shadow seemed charged with meaning, as though the walls themselves had absorbed and echoed the child's subtle signals. The dim lighting accentuated imperfections and disturbances, from dust smudges to displaced objects, each marking a precise moment of her struggle. Everett realized the mansion was no longer just a structure, it was a repository of fear, resilience, and carefully encoded communication, with each space offering a fragment of the story she had silently inscribed. He examined the hallway first, noting how furniture had been nudged slightly from its original position. Chairs, small tables, and rugs bore faint impressions where she had crouched, pressed, or shifted to gain a sense of control. Hair strands, caught along edges and scattered subtly across the floor, suggested moments of self-soothing or adjustment. Everett's gaze followed the pattern of movement, recognizing that these were not random traces but deliberate acts of preservation, each forming a silent language of fear, adaptation, and survival. The mansion's scale amplified her ingenuity, turning ordinary corners and shadows into strategic refuges. He moved into the first bedroom, where the faintest shifts in dust and minor displacements of toys indicated her recent presence. The meticulous arrangement of small objects, the tilt of a chair, the subtle flattening of a rug, all spoke to a child carefully navigating fear. Everett observed how these micro-actions created a mental map of the environment, allowing her to control exposure, find temporary safety, and express distress without words. Each element of the room now seemed to carry dual significance, functional in appearance but profoundly communicative when interpreted through her lens of experience. The study provided additional evidence. Light from a desk lamp cast long, wavering shadows across scattered papers, a hairbrush, and a few small toys. Each object bore faint traces of interaction, fingerprints in dust, slight misalignments, or frayed edges. Everett understood that she had used these items to mark safe zones, negotiate space, and leave messages in motion, translating emotional states into physical patterns. The mansion, in its grandeur, had inadvertently amplified her vulnerability, yet she had transformed it into a silent language of self-protection and subtle signaling, one that required his complete attention to decode. Everett's attention shifted to the corridor leading to the attic hatch. Dust along the floor and displaced objects indicated careful movement, pauses, and cautious observation. Each trace reflected her careful choreography, the strategic use of shadows, calculated proximity to doors, and manipulation of objects to create barriers or signals. Everett recognized the sophistication of these acts, a child using spatial intelligence to navigate fear and maintain autonomy. He understood that every corner of the house was part of an intricate, unspoken dialogue between her environment and her need for safety. Small details continued to reveal her presence. A scarf draped over a chair, slightly shifted books on a shelf, and faint scratches on a rug marked the areas she had touched repeatedly. Dust smudges suggested moments of stillness, perhaps when she assessed the space for safety or adjusted her posture to feel grounded. Everett pieced together these cues with careful attention, visualizing the tiny, deliberate movements that created a network of safety and communication throughout the mansion. The shadows of the rooms themselves seemed to reflect her careful design, amplifying both concealment and control. Even in the darkest corners, Everett detected subtle traces, hair strands, minor scuffs, and displaced small objects. Each element was a signal, a tangible footprint of her presence and a record of her strategies to manage fear. He noted how she had used both objects and negative space to communicate, leaving a trail that balanced concealment with legibility, frustration with ingenuity. The mansion's vastness, once comforting, now seemed to underscore the complexity of her efforts to remain safe while simultaneously seeking acknowledgement and connection. As he approached the stairwell leading to the attic hatch, Everett's pace slowed, and his focus sharpened. The combination of light, shadow, and environmental clues created a labyrinth of silent messages. Dust arcs, slight shifts in furniture, and the placement of everyday objects revealed deliberate actions, crouching, retreating, and pausing. Everett understood that she had not only been hiding but actively constructing a narrative through motion, a story of fear, strategy, and the need for protection in a world she could not fully control. Finally, at the base of the attic hatch, Everett noticed the faintest movement, a subtle ripple in a curtain, a light shift of a blanket, and the whisper of breath disturbed in the shadows. The accumulated signs he had been following, the hair strands, dust smudges, rope fibers, displaced toys, culminated here, pointing unmistakably to her location. Everett's heart pounded as he realized the precision of her hiding. She had not simply sought concealment but had crafted a position where she could monitor, react, and communicate subtly through her environment. Every prior clue now made sense. The basement markings, displaced objects, frayed ribbons, and sketches in the notebook had all built a narrative that led to this precise point. Everett's understanding deepened. Her whispered plea, the strategic use of corners and shadows, and the manipulation of objects were her language. He had begun to read it fully, tracing fear, autonomy, and ingenuity written in motion, finally recognizing the child's complex, silent dialogue with her surroundings. A soft gasp echoes from a hidden corner, confirming her presence. Everett Caldwell finally reached the shadowed alcove where his daughter had taken refuge, the culmination of a tense journey through the mansion that had revealed every nuance of her fear, resilience, and silent communication. She was curled tightly, small knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped protectively around a hairbrush and a frayed ribbon, the objects serving as shields against a world she had long found overwhelming. The dim light from the hallway partially illuminated her trembling form, accentuating the delicate lines of her face and the tension in her posture. Everett understood instantly that these objects were more than mere tools. They were extensions of her fragile sense of control, tangible anchors in an environment that had often felt threatening and unpredictable. He knelt carefully a few feet away, maintaining a presence that was deliberate yet non-threatening. Every step he had taken to follow the traces she had left, the dust impressions, the displaced objects, the frayed ribbons, the scattered hair, and even the subtle sketches she had produced, had built a narrative of her internal struggle. Everett now saw it fully. The child had been navigating fear with intelligence, ingenuity, and courage, using motion, space, and objects as instruments of self-preservation. This moment, finally confronting the living embodiment of those traces, carried the weight of both acknowledgement and responsibility. Her eyes, wide and shimmering with restrained tears, flicked toward him briefly, then returned to clutching her protective objects. Everett noted the way she shifted slightly, a subtle rocking motion that seemed to modulate her breathing and maintain a sense of groundedness. The alcove provided compressed security, compressing the space around her small body in a way that allowed her to regulate her fear while remaining vigilant. Every detail, the angle of her head, the grip of her hands, the slight tremor in her arms, spoke volumes about the intensity of her experience and the fragility of trust she still retained.